There is an interesting dichotomy to be unpacked when one starts to delve into the world of how we, as the civilized society that we are, choose to maintain the ideas of law and order. Although we operate within the stylized mechanism called the criminal justice system, it feels far more apt to refer to this simply as a legal system. As we have already seen and highlighted by only the few instances that we've covered, there appears at times to be an overwhelmingly evident divide between our intent and the actuality of these. Indeed, it would be fair to say the concepts of our laws being administered, punishments being delivered, and justice being achieved can, at best, only be described as casual acquaintances. While these acquaintances seem to spend such limited time together, their relationship is certainly strained even further when we are saddled with other, more complex circumstances. One such complexity is when the worlds of mental health and legal responsibility collide, as the multiple views, understanding, and emotions involved pressure this already difficult relationship. Although we recognise that we are in no way competent relationship counsellors, we look to test this on-again, off-again relationship here on the next episode of Just Lawful.
Adelaide is the perfect place to set a horror story. You know why all those films and books are always set in sleepy conservative towns? Because sleepy conservative towns are where those things happen. Exorcism, omens, shining, poltergeists. Adelaide is Amityville, or Salem, and things here go bump in the night.
Welcome once again to Just Lawful, where things do indeed go bump in the night. My name is Daniel Panozzo, and I'm once again joined by my co-host, Sean Fuster.
Thanks, Daniel, for having me as always, and welcome back, listeners.
Indeed. Before we begin, a huge thank you to everyone who is listening, whether you've listened to the broadcast on 5AA or you've checked us out on any platform that you choose, whether that's Spotify, iTunes, whatever that might be. If you haven't heard our previous episodes, we would strongly recommend and greatly appreciate you heading over there now and making sure you subscribe, leave us a 5-star rating. That helps us get up in the algorithm and helps us get out to the masses and anyone who may be wanting or needing to hear our work. You can catch up on all the episodes and the journey so far from there. As we embark into this new subject matter that I talked about just before, that world of mental health and legal responsibility, firstly, I'm going to take ourselves and also our listeners back to one of the real tenets of what Sean and I wanted this show to be and how we wanted this all to operate. And what I mean by that is, when we first came up with this concept, we always had the idea that we never wanted to tell our audience, or anyone for that matter, what to think and how they should go about their thought process.
And that's always been a tenement of my journalism from the very beginning. I'm interested in making you laugh, making you cry, making you think, but not telling you what that thought should be.
Absolutely. And one of the ways I actually described this to Sean right at the very start of this was, we want to paint a picture, but we don't want to tell you to how to paint your picture. So what we don't want to do is we don't want to hand you a piece of paper that's a colour by number, and this section with this number has to have that colour, and you must look at it in this light or this idea.
That'd be fairly hypocritical, given you and I have made our lives out of not colouring in the lines.
Absolutely, indeed it would be. We also recognise there's so much colour, and it's not black and white as we've talked about so many times. So what we've always strived to do when we talk about anything that we've done on this show and we'll do into the future is, yes, we want to provide you an easel and give you a wonderful big canvas. And I want to give you some amazing paintbrushes and some sponges and whatever else you want to use, and this huge array of coloured paints and acrylics and whatever it is you want to choose. We will give you the idea of what an image or an idea or a landscape might look like. What we never want to tell you how to do is how to paint that picture for yourself, however.
We've always said you're only ever entitled to an informed opinion. We're here to inform you. Your opinion is up to you.
Now, you might be asking yourself so far, okay, guys, you've sort of prattled on for a couple of minutes about this painting class that we suddenly, this is not an art class, it's not art therapy. We understand that, although there is huge benefits in that. So why are we talking about that? Sean, I want to put that to you. Why is it so important that before we start this next piece that we're going to unpack, that we make sure people understand we don't want any prescriptive ideas of what we've always thought about. We want you to come at this with an open idea, an open mind, and maybe paint your own picture here.
Because we're going to be dealing with an issue that I've been grappling with as a reporter my entire career, and right up into the days before recording this episode, my understanding of it has continued to evolve. And that is that intersection, as Daniel said, between the law and mental health. This is such a complicated piece, not of law, not of legislation, but of thinking and of empathy. Thinking about the fact that our understanding of mental health develops more and more every day. Our laws, of course, sometimes don't tend to develop, they tend to calcify. How do you marry these concepts together? How do you have some understanding for what a person is going through within their own psyche, but then how that affects the people immediately around them and the greater community around them? How do you balance competing interests like rehabilitation with protection? How do you look after one's own safety while also guaranteeing the safety of others? It's so incredibly fraught, and I'm fairly certain everyone out there that has brushed up against this topic has an opinion already. What we want to challenge you to do is keep listening and add more information, more paint to that opinion and see what you come up with out the other side.
I think that's really important, Sean, and the reason I think it's really important is, as you said, we all, myself included, come with our conscious and unconscious biases and our understandings and our ideas, and we only know how much we know at this very moment. What we really want to do is provide you the opportunity to continue to grow your understanding and your learning. As you said, we now know far more about mental health and the impacts to individuals, groups, families, and the society at large than we ever have before. And that will only continue to grow. We also know that that then has other repercussions or other ideas we need to truly understand or at least be cognizant of when we try to apply something like a legal system to this situation. And that's where it becomes really tricky, as you said. And we are absolutely going to look at some case studies here. We're going to look at some of the cases that you've covered, and we're going to unpack them and pull them apart and really try to understand where is that mental health piece, where is that legal responsibility piece, and as a society, are we yet evolved enough to truly understand how they work and have the compassion and empathy that you spoke about to sometimes, and I mentioned it before, and it wasn't by accident. I talk about the concept of, having that idea of everyone coming with a multiple view, everyone having different understandings, and certainly a different emotional space, because depending on who you are and where you stand in that situation at the time is going to shape all of those things very differently.
And I know there are listeners out there that are tensing right now. I know there are people who I have worked with over the years, victims and survivors, that are battening down the psychological hatches right now, knowing what we're about to deal with, what we're about to take you through. Trust us, we're not doing this lightly, and we're doing this, as we always do, for the reasons of increasing some understanding and increasing some debate around these issues. We want this talked about because, quite frankly, it needs to be talked about. Mental health cases are not going away. They are not lessening. They are not becoming more infrequent. They are becoming more frequent in our justice system. And we as a society need to understand these issues if we're going to be able to deal with them and grapple with them as we move forward.
That point you just made, Sean, we are seeing more mental health issues in the world around us, in our society, than ever before. Let me just give you a little bit of an understanding. To make an analogy, about 100 years ago, the amount of information that a human being would take in their lifetime is now equal to around about one singular day that we face every day now in the modern world. So put that in context. We have evolved, and let's say we take the last 200, 300, 400 years of evolution, and I talk about that across our customs, our civility, our technology, all of those things that have evolved, right? And we understand, especially in the last 20, 30, 40 years that you and I have been on this earth and seen just the evolution of how we live, why we live, the way we live in this digital age, right? How much that's evolved. We are still working with a prehistoric brain that has not evolved beyond the dinosaur times for ourselves. So what we are talking about is we have all of this evolved world and digital ecosystem around us, yet we are working with a brain that has not had the capability or simply the possibility to evolve at the same rate.
We're hooking a 386 up to the internet if you want to get PC about it.
Absolutely. So what that means is we are seeing brains that are not able to evolve to that level. And don't get me wrong, some people handle this better than others. We understand that.
We're talking about the hardware here, the literal mushy thing inside your skull right now.
And we know there's a whole lot of environmental and there's a whole lot of relational situations around that for each individual person that sparks that or doesn't spark that to be able to handle that as best as we can. Or unfortunately, as we've seen, in circumstances where there are more and more of these cases coming where mental health is playing a really pivotal, responsible role in this.
Interesting that you say responsible. We'll come back to responsible because that's a fraught word in this department.
It absolutely is. But again, that's not by accident because I understand that where does that sit from a responsibility piece? And I know that the cases we're going to cover really start to unpack what does that look like? How do we, I guess, assess that? And where do we put that responsibility? And how do we factor that against, what do we do with people who have these mental illnesses, have perhaps, found themselves in a situation where they have been the party that has done a crime? How do we work with those people?
And one thing that I want everyone out there to fix in your minds right now as we go on this journey is the words of former Californian Supreme Court Justice Peggy Fulton Hoare. She was a thinker in residence here in Adelaide for a while. I had the joy of getting to know her. And Judge Fulton Hoare used to say, if they're bad, jail them. If we're mad, rehab them.
Mm.
It's an interesting little line. I just want you to keep that in the back of your mind as we start going through this, because we will come back to what Judge Fulton Hoare said. So again, if they're bad, jail them. If we're mad, rehab them.
It's a really interesting piece, and it's a really good one to put, as you said, in the back of your mind, because we'll touch back on that as we continue in this process. With that said, Sean, you and I have covered some very light topics in the past: murder, death, assault, domestic violence. We've even touched on doomsday cults. So just some light stuff that we've done.
Oh, absolutely. It's all fun and games here on Just Lawful.
Indeed. And this is going to be another one of those where, we do make a little bit of light of that. It's not something to be laughed at. It's not something we take lightly. It is something we really want to shine a light. So as we said, to get some real understanding of, can we get those three ideas of laws being administered, punishments being delivered, and justice being achieved. Really shortly, we're going to start on where did your journey all begin? Sean, we talked a lot about the putting a framework around what we're about to talk about, and it's a really interesting subject. You and I have talked about this off air. I'm really interested in this, and I guess for me, it all starts with when you told me about where your journey begins. So why don't we go back to that point? For example, what's your first introduction for where mental health and I guess the legal world's crossed over for you?
So I started in the courts in February of 2002. Within a few weeks of that, I came across my first ever, what we call Section 269 case, a mental health case.
Sure.
I was at a loose end one day. I was looking at the case lists. I was the junior burger, as we called it, ourselves, the little court reporter with two seniors above me.
Yeah.
And I noticed that someone out at Holden Hill Magistrates Court, which no longer exists, in the northeast of Adelaide, was on a charge of attempted murder.
Right.
And I said to my seniors, can I go to that? They're like, oh, if you want to, it'll come to Adelaide eventually, but if you're bored, you can go out. So 2 o'clock in the afternoon, drive out to the Holden Hill Magistrates Court, about a 20-minute drive.
Yep.
And I get there, and the Holden Hill Magistrates Court was a smaller court.
Yes.
And when you walk into the lobby, I saw there was a man sitting to the left of the doors and a woman sitting to the right of the doors.
Okay.
And ferrying between them at all times was a small family.
Right.
Kids, 12 through 15, running messages backwards and forwards between these two people.
So in the lobby of the court, okay, yep.
And I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, okay, this is going to be some kind of familial dispute or a civil thing or something like that, obviously. But then they call the person on to face the charge of attempted murder, and the man gets up and walks into court.
Yeah, right, okay.
I thought, hang on a minute. I go in and I listen. I'm going to leave some names out here because I've been asked to by the people involved. But the man gets into court and he's accused of attempting to murder, the woman.
Well, I was going to say that. So, a charge of attempted murder, no, I guess, no one said police escort, but no accompaniment by any staff. That's odd in itself, is it not?
Well, I know it is now.
Yeah.
But at this point, Junior Burger Sean had no idea really what was going on.
Okay.
And I'm trying to take you back into that sort of that sense of what was going on, because this is all unfolding before me. I've been in courts, maybe 6 weeks at this point.
Okay.
As I'm seeing this. So, no police escort, no custody, no
that's what I'm
electronic
thinking.
monitoring that I can see, nothing like that. And this man walks in and the woman walks in behind. And the lawyer for the man gets up and says, Your Honour, my client is on bail for this charge of attempted murder. The victim in this case is his wife. We'd like to ask his bail conditions be changed.
Okay.
He wants to move back into the family house.
Okay, so just a quick check as we go. Check the score as we run through this. So, man who is accused of attempted murder has been out on bail.
Yep.
He's now come back to face that charge. The victim in this case is his wife,
who's sitting in the body of the court.
Who's also sitting in the court. And they're asking to change the bail conditions so that the husband who was accused can move back into the family home with the wife.
Now, think of the cases that we've just done in our most recent series on domestic violence. That's instantly where my young Junior Burger mind went.
Of course.
Why does she want him back? This is terrible. Is there some sort of threat involved? Is she scared? Is she, coercive control? All those sorts of things are flowing through my head.
Yeah.
And obviously they flow through the magistrate's head as well, because the magistrate says, I don't really think that's appropriate, counsel.
Yeah.
And the prosecution stands up and says, No, Your Honour, we disagree as well. There's no way that he should be allowed to stay in this room. The woman stands up in the back of the court and says, Your Honour, may I speak? The magistrate says, Well, it's highly unusual, but okay, I'll allow you to speak. She says, Your Honour, I forgave him the moment knife touched flesh. My husband is a good man. I love him. My family needs him back. I need him back. We need to be together again. This is not his fault. He's mentally ill.
Okay.
And that just knocked me for an absolute loop. Think about that for a minute. Acknowledging that your husband has a mental illness.
Yes.
Accepting that that is the reason why he attacked you with a knife. And that line that has never left me 20 years almost later. I forgave him the moment knife touched flesh.
Yeah, it's very powerful. As I heard you say that, that was sort of rolling through my head, and I was trying to, I guess, understand how you get to that point, or what that is, how you take that on board in that moment, as you were saying the rest of that. So
I'm looking at this woman as she's speaking, and I'm seeing for the very first time, because I'm really looking now, that she's scarred. She's got scars up and down her arms, both arms, scars around her face as well. This was not a single stab wound incident.
No.
This was a frenzied sort of assault.
Yeah.
You can tell just by looking at the wounds that have clearly healed up.
Sure.
And the lawyer for the man says, Your Honour, I'm supportive of this. Basically, the situation we've got is that my client had a psychotic break. He attacked his wife.
Yep.
He turned himself in immediately after.
Okay.
The reason he got bail at the time was because the psychotic break was acknowledged by the doctors. He's been bailed to live in a different location with a different family member. The family needs to be back together for financial reasons, for lifestyle reasons, and also so they can continue to mend their relationship.
Okay.
He's on medication. He's seeing his psychologist. He's being dealt with. There's no reason for them to be kept apart. The prosecutor stood up like a rocket and said, Your Honour, this is ridiculous. It's only because of an act of God that she's even still alive. Defense spat back, Your Honour, it's not for the prosecution to play God with this couple's relationship.
Yeah, right.
The tension in that room.
Yep.
And the magistrate said, Look, this is not a decision I can make. This is beyond me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send you all to the Supreme Court.
Okay. I'm glad you said that, because my question is rolling around. If the magistrate's saying it's not up to him to decide, where on earth do we go to decide this? So
he literally kicked this upstairs.
Look, I think you'd probably agree, the responsible decision in this case?
Well, look, Junior Burger Sean was just sitting there with his jaw slack going, I really don't fully comprehend what's going on here, but that sounds good to me.
I'm asking current Sean, not recognising that we're actually dealing with Junior Sean here. So I appreciate that. But I think current Sean would agree, responsible thing to do.
Yeah.
Junior Sean going, what on earth am I watching here?
Junior Sean's got that whole Simpsons voice breaking thing going on of, I think I'll call my manager, because I wanted to just get outside and pull out my primitive brand new cell phone and call my court senior and say, this is what's just happened in front of me. What am I actually watching?
Yeah.
So I called Mark Steen and Simone Reed, who were my seniors at the time.
Yeah.
And they put me on speakerphone. Sean, what's got you so upset? What are you talking about? I relayed it down the phone. And Steenie, as we called him, sprung straight into action. I'm going to call the newsroom, get you a photographer. This is huge. This is absolutely huge. It ran on the front page.
Right.
It was a big story because...
Sorry, just a sidebar there.
Yeah.
So 6 weeks into covering courts, Sean gets his first front page.
First court's front page, yeah.
Yeah. And that would be something that would be repeated how many times since, Sean?
Lost count since.
Exactly.
Lost count since.
Sorry, quick sidebar.
But at this point, that was exciting. But I hadn't gotten to excitement
No.
yet because I still didn't understand what was going on.
Absolutely.
So a photographer leapt in a car and raced out there. Like I said, 20-minute drive.
Yep.
Thankfully got there before the family left. They left in separate cars.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was up to me to recreate the incident for a newspaper story.
Mm.
And I had to explain the entire history of the case and this unique request on the part of a victim to let the man who stabbed her move back into the house, not out of fear, not out of coercive control, not out of intimidation, but out of love, out of forgiveness.
So just on that, so we move this onto the Supreme Court, and one thing I want to, and maybe we can get to that in this when we get to the Supreme Court. You talked about this being the result of a psychotic break.
Mm.
Had this been historically something that had happened in the past, or is this the first time, or what played out there?
So when we got to the Supreme Court, we got the full details.
Sure.
It was his first ever psychotic break.
Okay.
This was a man who had no past history and unfortunately broke psychologically due to pressures at his work, due to other things that were going on, absent the family.
Sure.
The actual stabbing itself happened in public, was witnessed by multiple people.
Yeah.
The man, as I said, came out of his psychotic break, looked down at what he'd done and turned himself into the police immediately.
Yeah.
He was actually the one that raised the alarm.
Yeah, right.
So imagine the horror in that moment, you know? Everything's normal. You're stressed, but everything's normal. You black out as far as you're concerned from your perspective. And when you wake up again, there's the person you love most in the world, or in his opinion, at that point, dead on the floor.
Yeah.
Yeah, he walked into the police station and said, I need your help. I think I've just killed my wife.
Right, so he was under the understanding that he's actually killed his wife.
That's right. Fortunately, she was still alive.
Sure.
The wounds were scarring, but comparatively superficial.
Yeah.
So the Supreme Court starts going through all of this and teasing all of that out and come to the conclusion that, look, so long as he is properly medicated, he doesn't pose a threat to her.
Okay.
So do we let him come back into the house or not? Because it's two different decisions.
Yeah.
Do you pose a threat? Yes or no? All right. On that decision, then, are you allowed to live in the house again? I'm watching all of this unfold. This is how I'm learning at the very coalface how the mental health laws, which we'll go into a minute, how they actually work. The woman is appearing in court again. She's speaking to the Supreme Court, making that impassioned plea to let him come home. After a series of hearings, the decision is made. They can go home together.
Okay.
They left court hand in hand, finally reunited.
Yeah, right.
They attended every subsequent court hearing as a couple.
Okay.
And when he was finally found not guilty by reason of mental incompetence and sentenced to a limiting term to be treated in the community, they left court hand in hand again. To my knowledge, they are still together to this day, and he has been medicated ever since, and they have not run into more problems.
So let's just, because that's a fascinating, unbelievable tale. So aside from this being, one of your probably first real cases, and one you've jumped out and raced out to have a look at yourself, that's a real baptism of fire in regards to understanding that. So this man has had a psychotic break, attacked his wife with a knife, thought he killed her, handed himself in, has had bail granted on those reasons. We've gone to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has, as you said, there's two parts to that. Do you pose a threat? We ascertain no, you don't. Off the back of that, do we let you then move back into the family home? And we say off the back of that, yes, we do. Released. They leave as a couple, clearly stating whatever her feeling was at the time was genuine, that it's through love. So you're watching mental health laws and the legal system as it pertains to real life people and a pretty horrific situation in real time as a pup reporter.
Yeah, and let's think of who Junior Burger Sean was. The kid fresh out of Gawler whose only encounter with mental health and the law was reading comic books.
Yeah.
You know, where villains are crazy and they get sent to Arkham Asylum and all that sort of thing. Here we're seeing it legit.
Yeah, first
and it's about love and forgiveness the very first time I hit it. And that was formative for me because that was a really empathetic way of coming into it and saying, okay, not all cases are going to be like this, but some cases can actually be like this.
Okay, so we need to understand this here. So this has been your first instance of this as a junior reporter. And you mentioned there before, and I think it's really important that we probably take a really good look at this. Let's step back. You mentioned law, Section 269?
Yeah,
okay.
Specifically, Section 269 of the Criminal Law Consolidation Act.
Okay.
Now, the Criminal Law Consolidation Act is a piece of legislation. Here's where I tell everybody to go to my favourite website, austlii.edu.au, and look it up. Go through it as we go through it here. austlii.edu.au. Great resource. Or go to the Legal Services Commission's website here in South Australia, and they will explain it to you as well. Criminal Law Consolidation Act does exactly what it says on the tin. Here is all the criminal law in the state consolidated into one act, rather than having a small section on murder, a small section on rape, a small section on robbery. Mush it all together.
All in one place.
All in one place.
Okay.
And so Section 269 deals with everything to do with mental health and criminal law.
Okay.
And it's got a lot of subsections.
Okay. So quick question. What was your understanding of Section 269 in that first case we just talked about?
At that moment?
Yeah.
Absolute zero.
Right. Okay. So you are starting from scratch at that point.
As I'm watching these people talk about mental incompetence and, you know, he's attempted murder, but he's been found psychologically unfit, I'm just sitting there. Again, I'm thinking Arkham Asylum, I'm thinking The Joker, I'm thinking Batman comics, because that's my entire exposure at this point. It's like, oh, so why isn't he... I mean, honestly, I'm thinking things like, why isn't he in a straitjacket?
Okay.
Does he go home to a rubber room? Are there going to be people that are going to take him away in a white van after this is done?
Okay.
You know, when the photographer came, I literally said to the photographer, keep an eye out for the van from the mental home. And the photographer, who was much older and much more experienced, just looked at me and said, kid, it doesn't work that way.
Right.
I was operating from zero understanding.
Okay. So this, obviously, this piece of legislation has been obviously a massive resource, as you said, to yourself in your understanding and evolution of how you perceive this situation.
Absolutely. And what it tries to do is try to marry together two absolutely incongruous concepts. Think about this for a minute. To commit a crime and be found guilty of a crime, you have to know or be capable of knowing that what you're doing is illegal.
Okay.
So if you flatten your foot to the floor and you see that the sign says 60, and you go at 120, you know you're breaking the law.
Okay.
Right? Therefore, you can be found guilty of a crime.
Sure.
Or, if you and I have a punch-up here in the studio, and you throw me toward that window, you are reasonably able to understand that if I fall out that window and die, it's going to be a crime.
Yeah.
It's nothing you foresee. It's nothing you intend.
No.
But you are conscious enough to realize I shouldn't be throwing people towards windows.
Sure.
You can be found guilty of a crime.
Okay.
So that's that first element. People who are mentally incompetent due to mental illness specifically, sometimes disability, and sometimes self-intoxication, and they're three very different things.
Okay.
We'll get to that in a minute.
I'm sure we'll touch on those.
Three different things. They're not capable of knowing their actions could be considered criminal.
Okay.
Does that mean, therefore, they can be held responsible for their crime?
Which is where that concept of responsibility we talked about earlier comes into very questionable circumstance at times.
Exactly. So let's look at this couple.
Absolutely.
Let's look at this unnamed couple. He had a psychotic break. In that psychotic break, he repeatedly stabbed his wife.
Yeah.
He was not capable of knowing in that moment that what he did was a crime.
Yeah.
Because he was not mentally making decisions. This is not an intentional thing, not a planned thing, nothing like that. Therefore, has he committed a crime?
Yeah.
Well, the answer is yes and no. It's Schrodinger's cat. She was definitely stabbed.
Absolutely.
She almost died. but he did not try to murder her
Yeah.
because he did not have the mental capacity to know that his actions would be criminal.
This is just the first moment where I want to take you back to the analogy I made early on. This is where you need to get your paint box out.
Yeah.
Because right now you're going to start to paint a picture. And on the surface, you could say, well, no, he had a knife, he stabbed her, that's a crime. Easy, right? That's paint by numbers.
Yep.
That's what we don't want you to do. Because right now we're going to ask you to expand that palette and really think about what are the shades of different circumstance, i.e. colour, that need to be applied to this.
And Section 269 wants to help you with those shades because they take a mental health case and separate it into two facets.
Okay.
There is the mental health element and there is the objective elements.
Okay.
The objective elements of the case that we've been talking about. Was there a person? Yes. Was she stabbed? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Did she suffer injuries? Yes. Did she almost die? Yes. Objectively, all of those things happened.
Correct.
Subjectively, is that a result of criminal action? Answer in this case, no it's not, because there wasn't a mental capacity to commit a crime.
Yeah.
So all mental health cases, be it the guy that runs past you at Coles and smashes the garlic up because he's off his head for the day,
Yeah.
right through to cases of murder, any mental health case is always split down those lines.
So this same lens is put over, it doesn't matter what's end of that spectrum,
Yep.
we put the same lens over it.
Yep.
Okay.
The guy that is a recent discharge from a mental health facility who steals your cigarettes at the bus stop will have the same lens put over him
Sure.
as the person who is mentally incompetent and threatens to blow up a building, stalks a politician, or does some other higher crime, for
Right.
want of a better term.
Right.
That is the ultimate lens.
So Sean, you talked about there's three distinct situations here. Just break that down for myself and our listeners so we can understand that. So you talked about one of them being a mental incapacity.
Yep. So mental incapacity is you have something that is diagnosable,
Sure.
whether it be something that was previously diagnosed or something that has only been diagnosed since the incident that would have been a crime otherwise.
Yep.
So in the case of this man, his first ever psychotic break, no warning ahead of time that he had mental health issues.
Sure.
Versus someone who's had mental health issues for years and unfortunately is unable to get them treated or isn't treated properly or isn't themselves not obeying the treatment regime and an incident occurs.
Okay.
Disability is the second one.
Sure.
Because, of course, and I don't think we need to go too deep into this, but people who have disabilities that affect their cognitive reasoning, that affect their levels of understanding, of maturity, of education, you can't have, for example, someone who has Down syndrome being held to the same level of accountability as someone who is unafflicted by that condition.
So we're talking about potential intellectual disability here,
That's
that
right.
sort of thing. Okay.
Cognitive function, things like people who come back from accidents on work sites
Sure.
and may have a degree of cognitive function
Gotcha.
impaired as a result. The third is the most controversial,
Yes.
and that's self-induced intoxication. Now, before anybody jumps up and down, this is not the drunk's defense.
No.
This is not, I had too many beers and she was asking for it. Not that at all.
Yep.
We're talking about people who self-medicate.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about people who have long-term substance abuse issues, and those issues create a mental illness.
Okay.
If you've heard the phrase drug-induced schizophrenia or drug-induced psychosis, that's what we're talking about.
Sure.
And that's where things get, as we'll discuss, really thorny.
And as you said, hopefully no one's jumping at their whatever device they're listening on at the moment. They're not jumping at that trying to yell at us. But as you said, there is a real piece around that because when you use the term self-induced, there is a natural reaction. You go, well, if it's self-induced, you've kind of brought that on yourself. I've got a diminished level of empathy and compassion toward that. This is, again, where we understand that can be a reaction. Let's sit back and actually try to take everything in to see if we have all the facts and all the understanding here.
And that's why I use the term self-medication.
Sure.
There is a lot of evidence out there that suggests that people who have undiagnosed mental health issues may turn to illicit drugs to try to deal with what's going on inside them.
Yeah.
They don't understand they have bipolar 1, bipolar 2.
Yeah.
They don't understand they have schizophrenia.
Yeah.
They understand they feel awful and they need to feel better. They may turn to illicit drugs to deal with that.
Okay.
It doesn't mean that the drug is the cause of their mental illness.
No.
So therefore, there is no self-induced intoxication there.
Yeah.
But what if you or I, who are normally of sound mind, to use that old legal term, get ourselves into a psychotic state because we have taken too much ecstasy, too much heroin, too much cocaine, whatever. And the psychotic state that we are in lasts exactly as long as that drug is in our body.
Yeah.
That's a different story, because that's when we're talking about things like, well, that's not an excuse. You haven't developed ongoing schizophrenia and psychosis as a result of your drug bender. You were just on a drug bender.
Yeah, okay. So interesting. So tell me then, in that case, what impact or impetus or influence does this have when we go through a legal proceeding on, say, I guess the responsibility, but more importantly, does it have an impact against sentencing, for example, or what that looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. So when someone pleads not guilty to a crime by reason of mental incompetence, saying, I didn't commit a criminal act because I was not mentally competent to understand it, one of two things will happen.
Sure.
If the prosecution accepts that the person is mentally ill or mentally incompetent, then it goes straight through to sentencing submissions.
Okay.
Similar to pleading guilty.
Yep. Okay.
If it's not accepted by the prosecution, then there has to be a trial.
Okay.
No jury, though. Trial by judge alone.
Okay, interesting. Okay.
And what's put on trial first is the mental element.
Right.
Let's get the experts in, let's get the psychologists in, let's get family members in, let's talk about this person's mental health. Do they or do they not have a mental impairment?
Yep. If
the answer is no, then we're off to the traditional criminal sentencing process from there.
Okay.
If the answer is yes, and 99.9% of the time the answer is yes, then we move into what's called a trial on the objective elements.
Okay.
Did the stabbing happen? Did it happen at this time, this place? Imagine a criminal trial without the question of guilt being involved.
That's a very interesting concept to try and understand itself. So just explain that again. So we're looking at that from what perspective?
A literal perspective of, did these facts happen in the order that they've been alleged?
Without the element of a criminal act sitting on top of that.
That's right. Did the person get punched? Did the car get crashed?
Okay.
Did the person fall off, get pushed off? Was the knife used? Was there a weapon involved? Is the CCTV footage an accurate representation of? All without the question of whether someone is guilty or not guilty. It's a question of whether the events happened.
Interesting stuff, Sean. I want to just continue this conversation in a moment because I'm just trying to get my head around that. So that's very fascinating. Sean, as I mentioned, I'm fascinated about this because, as you said, we need to have a look at the characteristics of what's occurred without the element of a criminal act being committed. So if we're taking a criminal act out of the situation, why do we need to do this? Because if there's no criminal act, no one's guilty, right? So we get acquitted?
You don't get acquitted.
Okay. This is the part that I'm trying to get in my head. So help me understand this.
So if you are in the first phase of the trial, found not guilty by reason of mental incompetence, in the second phase of the trial, they find the objective elements proven.
Yes.
It means that you did it, but it's not a crime.
Yeah, okay.
It's not a crime because of you, rather than not being a crime because of your actions. If you're found not guilty in a criminal court, in a normal, non-mental health capacity, it's the idea is that the acts you committed did not reach the point in law that considers them a crime.
Okay.
Think back to Jack Hanley.
Yeah.
Right? That's the best example I can point you back towards, that very first case that we covered.
Yeah.
Here in the mental health space, you are incapable of committing a crime.
Okay.
But the thing you did was definitely a crime.
A crime. Yeah, okay. So what happens? What happens there? Because that's the part that I think I get that concept now. What I want to know, okay, if we next phase of this, because we generally have a sentencing phase.
Yep, and you don't get sentenced because you're not guilty.
So what happens?
You get given a limiting term.
Okay, explain what that means.
Okay, let's break both words down.
Sure.
Term, period of time.
Gotcha.
Limiting, a set of controls on your life.
Okay.
So, the idea of a limiting term is that if you were not affected by mental illness,
yes,
you would have gotten a sentence of X years.
In jail.
In jail.
In prison, yeah.
Yep. And also on parole and everything else.
Sure.
because you are not guilty by reason of mental incompetence, but what you did would have otherwise been considered a crime,
Sure.
you serve a limiting term, which is a period under mental health supervision,
Yes.
equal to the sentence you would have received had you been healthy.
So at some point, and if we take it back to what you said, in a judge-only trial, the judge would take all those factors and go, if this was sentenced as a crime, you would be sentenced with X number of years. As it's not, we're going to put the concept of a limited term on, which is going to be for the same subsequent amount of time.
Spot on. You've got it.
Okay.
Congratulations. You've just passed the bar.
I would like to... I'm going to differ there, Sean. I think you're going to have a lot of people talking to you from the legal fraternity next time you're
Daniel
out and about.
Panozzo QC, available now for weddings, parties, bar mitzvahs.
I think you've got a lot of your legal fraternity friends who are going to have a quiet word to you about that statement right there.
Well, speaking of legal fraternity friends, let's go to one of our old friends in the legal fraternity
Sure.
for what I think is the best explanation of a limiting term.
Great.
Better than mine. And this comes directly from the mouth of a judge. A limiting term is not punishment. It is to be a term equivalent to the period of imprisonment that would have been appropriate had you been convicted of the offence.
Okay.
This is to be set not taking into account your mental illness.
Right.
It's an appropriate period of supervision relevant to your conduct. So only the objective elements detail how long you need to be in mental health for.
Okay.
So this is important. I'll tell you why. It's not you have schizoaffective disorder, you have bipolar 1, you have bipolar 2. The doctors say you're going to need treatment for the next 6 months and then you'll be fine. You go in for 6 months. Not at all.
Okay.
It's you stabbed somebody, you robbed somebody, you set something on fire, you blew something up. In a normal criminal court, you would get 7 years jail. So you will be under mental health supervision for 7 years.
Right.
Your conduct dictates the length of your supervision.
Right, okay. I think I've got that.
Right? So the judge goes on and says, this is to enable treatment to be conducted and to allow the community to be protected while that treatment is undertaken. You're a dangerous person.
Yes.
It's not your fault you're a dangerous person because you've got a mental illness,
Yeah.
but the community has the right and expectation to be protected from you while you become well.
Okay.
If you were a criminal, I would send you to jail for 7 years. I'm going to keep using 7 years as a number.
Sure.
If you were a criminal, I would send you to jail for 7 years because that's how long you should be away to protect the community, pay your penance, and rehabilitate.
Okay.
Because you're not a criminal, you're mentally ill, I'm going to send you into mental health treatment for 7 years. That way the
Right.
community is protected for the same amount of time it would have been had you been a criminal.
Okay.
A court is to have regard to all the matters that would normally be relevant to the fixing of a sentence, but not matters arising from your mental illness. I, as a judge setting your limiting term, no longer care at this moment that you have whatever condition you have from DSM-5. I care about protection of the community. I care about rehabilitation. I care about adequate sentencing provisions.
Mm-hmm.
I care about everything that I care about if I were handling a straight up and down crime.
Sure.
So keep in mind, as we go through all these cases, it's a two-stage process.
Yeah.
Are you ill? What sentence would you have gotten if you were not ill?
Okay.
The sentence that you would normally have gotten will be converted into a limiting term,
Mm-hmm.
during which you will rehabilitate. And here's the last wrinkle in all of that. If I jail you for 7 years as a judge for a robbery,
Yes.
you're going to get parole
Yes.
some point in that 7-year period. Limiting terms are not automatically served under lock and key. Some limiting terms are served in the community
Okay.
partially, some are served wholly. It all depends on what level of risk the person poses to the community.
Okay. So that's interesting. So as you said, so at that point, even though we no longer care about what the mental incapacity symptom or circumstance is, we now need to look at what sentence would you have gotten for that act,
Mm-hmm.
give you a limiting term on that.
Mm-hmm.
Now we have to almost take a side step back to go, however, based on what risk you may be based on your mental incapacity, we now need to put that as a provision of where you serve your limiting term.
Yeah, so the process ping-pongs around.
Yeah.
It starts with mental illness.
And that's what I'm thinking.
Then it ping-pongs across to the objective elements.
Yes.
Then that sets the limiting term.
Yep.
But then it ping-pongs back to mental illness with, okay, you've got this limiting term. Where should you be housed?
Sure.
How long should you be housed there? Should you be allowed to go out on day trips? How many people should supervise you? All of those decisions are made with another facet, which is called a license.
Okay.
A license is simply a fancy way of the court giving you mental health parole.
Okay.
What are your conditions?
Indeed. Certainly, as we said, really interesting concept of trying to get those pieces I talked about before. How do we serve the laws? How do we get punishment? Yet how do we get justice out of all of that as well? Before we move on, really important piece, because we haven't spoken yet. Who set that statement?
So that was Judge Adam Kimber. And if that name sounds familiar to long-time JL listeners, it's because Adam Kimber is the previous Director of Public Prosecutions in South Australia.
And it's fair to say, Sean, that in the past, about certain, behaviours, decisions, whatever it might, you've taken exception at some of those as perhaps not...
Great exception.
Absolutely, as not, in your perspective, not the best way to go about things. However, you're very receptive to this statement.
I think it's a clear statement. I think it's a clear and unambiguous statement. And I have sat through a lot of 269 cases over the years, over literally 20 years since that very first day as a junior burger out at Holden Hill Courts. I have never in 20 years heard a limiting term explained better than what Judge Kimber did there.
Yeah, good work. Good work. Look, and with that... That is an incredibly... We've traversed what feels like a lot so far, yet at the same time, Sean, we've only talked about one case briefly.
Yeah, because you need to understand the law here.
Yeah, and hopefully we've done that and set a bit of a foundation for that, because when we start to unpack this further on our next episodes, we're going to look at how 269, that evolution of the young Sean and his understanding of how mental health and the legal system crosses over really gets tested in some very interesting cases coming up.
And also, it's fair to say that this has been a very bloodless analysis of the law, because it's very easy for us to sit here and say, oh, this is what a lawyer does, this is what a judge does, this is how it ping-pongs back and forth. We're not forgetting, but we are not mentioning at this point the most essential element in all of this for everything we do in JL. The victims.
Yeah, indeed.
Because every single one of these cases has one, if not multiple victims. And if we need 40 minutes to sit and explain to you how someone can be not guilty of something that would have been a crime and get a sentence that isn't a sentence, that may or may not be served in a community or in a facility, how do you think people who have lost loved ones are going to feel about this entire situation?
That's the point I was interested in, Sean, because you talk about victims. One may be multiple victims across the cases we're going to cover. And it's fair to say when we look at those, victims look at these very differently.
Oh, look, this is incredibly complex, and this is not easy to swallow. It's easy enough for me to explain it to you right now, but now add in grief, add in trauma, add in suffering, because what we've just done is an academic exercise, a mental exercise on the best way to merge together these two concepts. What we're going to see in our next episode is the tensions that arise when that's actually put into place in reality.
And until we get to that point, we do, once again, as we always do, want to thank everyone who has listened to us, whether that be on the broadcast with 5AA, whether that be on the socials, or whether that's, on our platforms of iTunes and Spotify where you can get the podcast. Please go there, rate, review, do all those great things. Tell us what you think. If you want to get in contact with us and give us some feedback over the social media streams, of course, you can do that at Just Lawful Podcast on Facebook and Instagram, at Just Lawful Pod on Twitter. You can, of course, as always, follow Sean and all of Adelaide's true crime and his work with the Advertiser at Sean Fuster on Facebook and Twitter. This has been a really, as you said, Sean, informative and I'll say foundational episode, because when we start to unpack this, once again, I want people to start to remember, next week we want you to bring back your palette and your paints and that canvas and that easel, because we're going to start really asking you to paint your own picture and let go of that paint by numbers concept.
Yeah, it's going to be some muddy colours by the end of it.
Indeed it will. And until then, as always, we want to remind you, enjoy our work, but don't become our work. and we'll speak to you on the next episode of Just Lawful.